when I do a lesson where I'm kind of lecturing, okay, you'll often find that it's set up like this. And in the notes package, it doesn't look exactly like this, but it has the same text. It'll say Lesson 1, Alchemy and Atomic Models, and it'll say the key points, right? The reason I have the key points there on the first slide, these are the things you need to be watching for as we go through. They're the kinds of things that are going to end up on a quiz. Okay, or a multiple choice question on a unit exam, or a written response question on a unit exam, okay, something like that. Those are the things that are most important. So be on the lookout for them. They're the things you might want to highlight in your notes package, or if you printed it off, or or if you're doing it on a laptop, you can still highlight it, okay, or make some jot notes about it on paper, things like that. Those are the things to watch for. Question? Yeah, this is all in the notes package. Yeah. Okay, like if we go, sorry, back to that notes package here. Right, it just doesn't have the PowerPoint background kind of thing, right? It's just got here's the key points, but it's exactly the same text. And oftentimes a lot of the diagrams are also, the important diagrams will be in there as well. Yeah. Okay, so the key points for today: understand how theories of the structure of the atom were developed. We're kind of looking at the structure of the atom from two perspectives. One, we need to understand the parts of the atom and its structure, okay? But we also want to look at it from a scientific development perspective. Okay, and that means, why did we think it looked like this, then thought it looked like this, and then thought it looked like this? Why did our idea keep changing? What was the process involved in developing what we currently accept to be the model of the atom? Okay, how did that come about? Because really, it's a demonstration of how science is supposed to work. Okay, you come up with a hypothesis, you test it, okay, and if you can repeat those results, you accept it, and then it becomes accepted knowledge. But then when someone else does something that doesn't agree with that, we have to look at possibly changing our idea. Okay, and so that's kind of the other perspective that we'll look at it from. Okay, and obviously we need to learn the parts of the atom and their characteristics. Now, we're looking at the most basic parts of the atom. What are the three basic parts of the atom? Okay, so we got electrons. Okay, what else? Protons and neutrons. Okay, so those are going to be the three parts. Now, if we break the atom up as we currently accept it, there's two regions. There's the place where the protons and neutrons are, which is called the nucleus, right? And then we got the electrons that are basically in a cloud, okay, that surrounds the nucleus, and they can move around within that cloud, both closer to the nucleus and further away, depending on energy and things like that. Okay, so where did chemistry come from? Well, chemistry came from something called alchemy. Alchemy was not a science. Okay, it was before the scientific method was invented. Alchemists were people who were trying to do things that we now know to be impossible. They were trying to transmute cheap substances like lead into gold and get rich. They were trying to find things like the elixir of life that would allow them to live forever. Those were really poorly done experiments that usually wound up killing people. They made lots of really poisonous things and stuff like that. Okay, in fact, there's stories of like czars and kings and stuff that were poisoned by their like scientists. Okay, so they're like, oh, you should drink a cup of lead every day, or like stuff like that, just dumb stuff, right? And we now, of course, know that that's not a good idea. But yeah, they had all kinds of weird ideas, and they didn't really have a set of rules that governed what they did or how they did their experiments. They basically like, oh, I got these two things, I'm gonna mix them together and see what happens. Okay, like trial and error is not science. Okay, they had no really reason or any idea backing what they were doing. They were just trying stuff. Okay, and while that was it, we learned a lot from that. It wasn't science per se. Right? Okay. Early on, there were different ideas about what made up matter. Okay, the most widely accepted view early on was that everything was made of 4 elements. Okay, and what were those 4 elements? Earth, air, fire, and water, right? Okay, those were the 4 elements. And in fact, the Greeks had like almost a periodic table of sorts to go with the 4 elements. Okay, if you were looking at steam, for example, steam was some parts water, some parts fire, and some parts air. It made sense, right? You had to come, steam was kind of air, and you got it by mixing fire and water. right? So that's how you, so they had this kind of reasoning that went along with that. If they were looking at like lava, well, lava was some parts earth and some parts fire. It came out of the earth and it was hot, so it made sense. Okay, they had this reasoning behind their idea, and given the level of education and the level of knowledge of the people at that time, it was acceptable. Okay, but along comes this guy named Democritus. And he says, you know what, I think this whole idea of the four elements is wrong, and that everything is made of these tiny particles that you can't see, called atoms. How well accepted do you suppose that was? No, he didn't get killed. Actually, it didn't turn out all bad for Democritus. He came up with another idea later. What's his name sound like? Democracy. It didn't all go. He wasn't a science guy, right? Like, he wasn't accepted as a science guy. Unfortunately, he was right. Okay, but nobody accepted that idea because more respected thinkers like Plato and guys like that were like, no, it's four elements. Go think of something else. Okay, but being a Greek thinker was a pretty good gig, right? You got to like sit in the what do they call it? The Parthenon, or Acropolis, or something like. And they got to sit in those, and people like fanned them with the big palm leaves and fed them grapes, and they just had to come up with stuff all day. Right? Some of the ideas were good, like this one, but it wasn't accepted because people were like, so I'm supposed to believe in these tiny invisible particles. Yeah, you know what? The fire water thing makes more sense to me. All right. So, like I say, his ideas were overshadowed, okay, but his ideas resurfaced many years later, okay, thousands of years later, unfortunately for him, okay, and were found to actually be somewhat reasonable. Now, during the Middle Ages was when the alchemists were around. So this is like Leonardo da Vinci's lab. Okay, Leonardo da Vinci was kind of an alchemist. He tried all kinds of crazy things. He had all kinds of weird ideas because apparently he like never slept. Okay, so sleep deprivation allowed him to come up with these kind of crazy schemes. Okay, but there'd have been, like flasks and mortars and pestles and test tubes and all kinds of weird looking scientific like things, okay, that they would have used to do their experiments. Okay, and they were able to accomplish a few things. Okay, learn, kind of what combinations would produce certain reactions and stuff like that. But they didn't really record anything, and they certainly didn't share their results. And that's one of the most important parts of the scientific process is, I did this experiment and this is what my results were. Could you replicate it? Okay, you share your results and you see if other people can replicate it. You get peer review. Okay, those are all really important things. Well, the alchemists didn't want to share their results with anybody. In case they came up with a way to change lead into gold, they had to keep that to themselves. Okay, so they didn't share their stuff, and as a result, it really stymied the whole process. Okay, now after alchemy, there were these two guys, Antoine Lavoisier and Roger Bacon. Okay, they came up with the scientific method. That was their contribution. Okay? The scientific method is, I have this problem that I'm investigating. I'm going to design an experiment with a manipulated, responding, and controlled variables. I'm going to have a procedure that's controlled, and I'm going to test the effects of this on this. And I'm going to record my data. I'm going to analyze my data, come up with a conclusion, have it repeated by a peer, okay, and that's going to be our process. They're the guys that came up with that, and that led to true sciences of all kinds, okay, biology and physics and chemistry, okay. It led to all of those processes now being much more effective, okay. So that was kind of the golden age of science, okay, at that point. Now, if I take any material and I start cutting it smaller and smaller and smaller, is it still the same material? It is, right? Cutting it doesn't change what it is. It just changes how big the pieces are. Well, the idea of the atom is that you can keep cutting a material smaller and smaller and smaller until you come down to a single particle of it. Now, obviously, there's no knife small enough to do that, okay? Because any knife, even on the sharp edge, is millions of atoms across, okay? Like, atoms are really, really that small. But if we kept cutting something down, 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 and we could actually cut it that small, eventually we get to the point where we had a single atom of it. Well, that single atom still has all the same properties that the big chunk I started with does. Same melting point, same boiling point, okay? Same atomic mass, density, color, all that kind of stuff. Well, no, but it's an atom can't melt, yes, but the material that it is can, right? So the smaller the pieces doesn't change the properties, all right? And it's good because otherwise, you might be able to split the atom while cutting carrots at home, okay? obviously you can't do that. Okay, you don't get them like kaboom in a mushroom cloud when you're making soup. Okay, because obviously atoms are too small, right? But we can't change the properties of a material by putting it into smaller and smaller pieces. Okay, at least from a physical perspective, right? Now, if we had a nuclear reactor, can we do that? Yes, we can. Okay, a nuclear reactor does in fact break the atoms up into different pieces, and when you do that, then you do actually change the atom. Right? That's why the end products of a nuclear reaction are different than the starting materials are. Okay, you get different atoms at the end because you actually have broken the atoms apart. Now you can only do that with certain kinds of atoms. Okay, you can do that with really large unstable ones like uranium and plutonium and things like that. Okay, they break up. Right? But a small atom like oxygen, you're not going to break it. Okay, it's too small. Okay, so an atom then is the smallest particle of an element that retains the properties of that material. Okay, so if we're looking at this, that would be what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's going to be nitrogen. That's an atom of nitrogen, apparently. There's 7 protons in there. Okay, if I had a whole tank full of that, I'd have, you know, a countless number of those identical atoms. Every atom of nitrogen looks exactly the same. Okay, has the same properties because every atom is exactly the same. 7 protons, 7 neutrons, 7 electrons. Okay. All right. Now, the idea of the atom resurfaced with a guy named John Dalton. Okay. Dalton is credited with coming up with the modern atomic theory. We say modern, even though it was like, you know, the 1700s when he did it, but it's the modern theory of the atom. Okay. And his points are as follows, and they make sense when we start thinking about the behavior of matter. He did a lot of experiments with chemical reactions, chemical and physical properties, before he came up with these 4 points. Okay, the first point is that all elements are composed of tiny, indivisible, not invisible, indivisible, which means you can't split them. Okay, particles called atoms. Okay, who did he take that from? That's Democritus' idea. Okay, so it wasn't an original idea, but he had more evidence to prove that it was true. Okay, all right, so tiny indivisible particles called atoms. Now, again, this is the 1700s. This is before the Manhattan Project and, you know, finding out that we can actually break atoms down into smaller pieces. Okay, but from a physical perspective, this is true. Okay, unless I have highly specialized, highly technical equipment, I can't divide an atom. Okay, so it still holds true for the most part. Okay, second point. Atoms of the same element are identical. So, like I said, if I had a tank full of nitrogen gas, every atom of nitrogen gas in there is the same. Okay. Somewhat true. True 99% of the time. Okay. There are things called isotopes. Okay. There are actually a few atoms of nitrogen in that tank that wouldn't be exactly the same as all the others. They might have an extra neutron, something like that. But for all intents and purposes, they're all the same. Okay. Third point, atoms of different elements can combine with one another in simple whole number ratios to form compounds. There's several important parts to that statement. Okay, so the important parts are this whole number ratios thing. If I put 2 atoms together to form a compound, it's 2 whole atoms or 3 whole atoms or however many atoms there are, but it's always a whole atom. Okay, I can't split an atom in a chemical reaction. Okay, I would never end up with, let's say, something like this. Here's water. That's normal water, right? I don't write it like this, H1/2O, right? Or H1O1/2, right? Like that would be like the same ratio, right? I wouldn't write it like this, HO1/2, because that's saying I have how much oxygen? Half. I can't have half an oxygen atom. Okay, half an oxygen atom is something else. Okay, it's not oxygen anymore. So they always combine in whole numbers. You can't have part of an atom in a chemical reaction in a compound. Okay, always going to be whole numbers. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, so that's what essentially that's what a chemical reaction is. Okay, or how a compound is formed is by more than one atom joining to another, joining together. Okay. All right. And the fourth point, okay, chemical reactions occur when atoms are separated, joined, or rearranged. Okay, when we talk about chemical reactions much later on in the unit, you'll see kind of what we mean, but I'll show you at least kind of an idea here. A very simple chemical reaction could be something like this. Okay, there's a simple chemical reaction. I have two elements that are combining to form a compound. Okay, so atoms can be separated, joined. This would be an example of joined. Okay, an example of atoms being separated could be the process by which we make rocket fuel. Okay, we electrolyze water. That is, we run a strong electric current through it and it separates the hydrogen from the oxygen and we end up with this. Okay, so we end up with that reaction there. I've now separated those atoms. Okay, are they all still whole numbers? Yeah, I don't have any half atoms anywhere. Okay, everything's still a whole. It's a 2 or a 1 or a 3. Okay, or they could be rearranged. So I could have a reaction like this. Okay, these are two different compounds. They're going to have a reaction with each other, and they'll end up with different partners. Actually, copper sulfate should look like that. Okay, they've rearranged, right? They're all still there. Okay, and that's another important thing to remember is that I'm not changing what I have in a reaction. I'm changing who goes with who, but I still have the same stuff, right? I have copper, magnesium, chlorine, and sulfate. Okay, I didn't magically get lead somewhere. Okay, that was kind of this atomic theory was kind of the death of alchemy. Okay, it said that no matter what you do in a chemical reaction, you're not going to produce new elements. You can only have the elements you started with. Can you produce new compounds? Yeah, but you can only have the stuff, the elements that you started with. Okay, and that's kind of the important point. Okay, in point number 4. Okay, atoms of one element are not changed into atoms of another by a chemical reaction. Okay, that's the important part. That was, you can't transmute something. Okay. Question? Yes, when they burn the rocket fuel, water is one of the byproducts. That's not a chemical reaction. So I'm saying by a chemical reaction, I can't make new elements. In a nuclear reaction, absolutely. Yeah, and we do. We have, particles fly off, and I end up, in a reaction where I'm splitting uranium. I actually end up sometimes with plutonium, with radioactive forms of lead. Okay, afterwards. Yeah, I do actually, because I'm physically changing the atom. I'm hitting it with particles that break it up. Yeah. Okay. Fusion would be the same thing. I would take 2 hydrogen atoms or 3 hydrogen atoms, force them together, and make a helium atom. Yeah. In those cases, those aren't chemical reactions, though. They're nuclear reactions. Okay. Everyone all right with those? All right. So we don't actually change the elements that we start with. We change how they're joined, or if they're joined, or what they're joined with, but we don't change the actual materials that we had. All right, so when Dalton came up with this theory, the first question people asked was, okay, that all seems reasonable. You've got these experiments that show that that's what's happening. You showed that you can't change something into, lead into gold. Okay, you showed that they're whole number ratios. We get that. What do they look like? Well, Dalton really didn't have an answer for that. Atoms are incredibly small. He couldn't see them. Okay, and at that time, nobody knew about protons, neutrons, and electrons. We didn't find that out till much later. So he just said they probably look like a sphere. Lots of things in nature are spheres, right? The planets, the stars, they're all balls. So an atom is a little ball. And people were like, okay, that's good. That'll be fine. We'll buy that. Okay. There wasn't anything to say it was wrong. There wasn't really a lot to say it was right either. But it was accepted because that's what we knew. Okay. And that's kind of the process that we want to move into here, kind of going forward is, all right, this was the model we had to start with, but then we learned this. So what do? We got to change our model. Okay. Chemistry, the model of the atom, is a good example of that. Biology has several bad examples of it. Okay. For example, when I was in high school, there were 2 kingdoms that all life fit into. Everything was a plant or an animal. Okay. There are now 5. Okay. There's much more because back when I was in high school, a mushroom was in the plant kingdom. Why is that a problem? It's not a plant, right? It doesn't carry out photosynthesis. All plants carry out photosynthesis. A mushroom is a fungus. Okay? It actually digests food in the same way that we do. It uses enzymes to break down other materials. It's not a plant. Okay? But it got put in the plant kingdom because it grew out of the ground. Okay? Even after people knew that it didn't carry out photosynthesis and wasn't a plant, they left it there because it was easier to just forget about that little one that didn't fit the mold than change the system. Okay? Now, eventually, smarter, more open-minded people came along and said, look, we got a lot of things that don't fit. Okay? Like we're saying that bacteria are plants. Well, they're not. They're different. Okay? So we had to change our thinking to meet with the new data and new results that we had found. Okay? Chemistry did a good job of that as we progress through the different models of the atom. So I'm going to leave it there for today, okay? And then we'll start up there for tomorrow. So tomorrow, if you can, have at least lesson 1, okay, in the notes package with you, okay? Hopefully like the chemistry unit on your phone or all of them or whatever, okay? Just have that notes package for tomorrow in whatever form you're going to have it.